Hey guys, tonight we begin with a side of ancient Rome that the marble statues and history textbooks tend to ignore. Because while Rome liked to advertise itself as the center of civilization, a large part of the population lived in places that were less imperial and more try not to get stabbed on the way home. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining from around the world. When most people imagine ancient Rome, they picture something very elegant. Marble temples glowing in the sunlight, senators walking around in crisp white togas looking thoughtful and important, triumphal arches, statues of heroic generals, and fountains gently splashing in picturesque plazas. In other words, the Rome you would see on the brochure. And yes, that Rome absolutely existed, but it was not where most Romans lived. Those beautiful monuments were basically the city's public relations department. If ambassadors, traders, or visiting dignitaries arrived in Rome, this was the version they were shown. Look at our temples. Look at our roads. Look at how civilized we are. What they did not immediately show visitors were the neighborhoods a few streets away, because the real Rome was loud, crowded, chaotic, and occasionally smelled like something had died, and nobody wanted to deal with it. By the 1st century, Rome may have had around 1 million residents. That made it the largest city in the ancient world. Unfortunately, it was also a city that had never heard of zoning laws, building inspectors, or the radical idea that streets should be wide enough for 2 carts to pass without starting a diplomatic incident. Space was limited, which meant buildings went up, very far up. Most Romans lived in apartment blocks called insulae. These were tall, narrow buildings stacked several stories high and squeezed into tight streets like architectural Tetris. The lower floors were more desirable and therefore more expensive. The higher you went, the cheaper the rent became. Also, the closer you were to meeting gravity in a very personal way if the building collapsed. Because the construction quality of many insulae could be described as ambitious. Landlords liked to build quickly and cheaply. Wooden beams, thin walls, and questionable foundations were common. Fires happened often. Collapses happened occasionally, which made the phrase top-floor apartment slightly more dramatic than intended. Meanwhile, the streets below were constantly busy. Street vendors shouted their prices. Carts rattled loudly over stone roads. Donkeys wandered wherever they pleased. Neighbours argued through walls that were roughly the thickness of a Roman sandwich. And because Rome did not have modern garbage collection, residents sometimes solved the problem by throwing waste out the window, which meant walking down a Roman street required awareness, agility, and perhaps a mild sense of fatalism. Ancient writers like Juvenal complained about this constantly, not just the crowds, but the noise, the smells, and the occasional airborne surprises. So while Rome loved to present itself as the capital of civilization, most of its citizens experienced a very different version. A city of leaning buildings, crowded alleys, and neighborhoods where daily life was less about philosophy and more about not getting robbed, or hit by someone's leftover dinner. Now that we have established that Rome was crowded, noisy, and occasionally hazardous to your dignity, we need to talk about where most people actually lived. The answer was the insulae. These were Rome's apartment buildings, and they were everywhere. Entire neighborhoods were filled with them, rising several stories high and packed tightly along narrow streets. If you imagine something like a modern apartment block, you're already being too generous. Insulae were usually built quickly, cheaply, and with the architectural philosophy of we will worry about the consequences later. They were essentially Roman skyscrapers for the working class. A typical insula might have 4, 5, or even 6 stories. In earlier periods, some reached ridiculous heights before Roman authorities finally decided that maybe allowing landlords to build towers made mostly of wood was not the greatest long-term strategy. Emperor Augustus eventually set limits on how tall they could be. Later emperors had to repeat this rule, which tells you how seriously landlords took safety regulations. Which is to say, not very. The ground floor was the most desirable. Shops and businesses operated there, and wealthier tenants could rent the lower apartments. These units were larger, sturdier, and had easier access to the street. The higher you climbed, the worse things became. Upper floors were cramped, poorly ventilated, and often built with lighter materials. Residents had to carry water upstairs by hand because plumbing rarely reached that high. Imagine hauling buckets of water up 5 flights of stairs every day just so you could cook dinner. Rome's version of a gym membership. The risk of collapse was always present. Ancient writers describe buildings that suddenly gave way because the structure was weak, or the landlord had decided to add another floor without asking the laws of physics for permission. Fires were also common. Oil lamps, wooden beams, crowded living spaces, and cooking fires made the insula perfect environments for disasters. Once a fire started, it spread quickly, and if you lived on the top floor, escape could be difficult. Yet despite all these problems, people continued to rent these apartments, because if you worked in Rome, you needed to live close to where the work was, and that meant accepting a home that might lean slightly to one side and occasionally make unsettling noises at night. In other words, Roman housing was affordable, but the term stable living environment was negotiable. If ancient Rome had a neighbourhood that every parent warned their children about, it was the Subura. The Subura was located just northeast of the Roman Forum, squeezed between several hills, including the Esquiline and the Viminal. That meant it sat right next to the political and ceremonial heart of the empire, which is a little ironic, because only a few hundred meters away from the Senate, triumphal arches and magnificent temples was one of the most chaotic and notorious districts in the city. The Subura was loud, it was crowded, and it had a reputation. The streets were narrow and packed with activity at all hours. Shops lined the ground floors of insula. Bakers, blacksmiths, cobblers, barbers and merchants competed loudly for customers. Above them towered apartment buildings filled with tenants who were also making noise, arguing with neighbours, cooking meals, and occasionally dropping things out the window. Sometimes accidentally, sometimes not. If you walked through the Subura during the day, it felt like the entire city had gathered in one place. Vendors shouted prices, carts rattled over stone streets, children ran between buildings, and somewhere nearby someone was always arguing about money. But as busy as the Subura was during daylight, it became even more unpredictable after dark. Taverns filled with gamblers and soldiers, brothels opened their doors to late-night customers, and the darker corners of the district became comfortable workplaces for pickpockets and other professionals in the field of taking things that did not belong to them. Roman writers often complained about the Subura, describing it as noisy, dangerous, and morally questionable, which of course made it one of the most lively areas in the city. Interestingly, the Subura was not exclusively poor. People from many different social classes passed through it, because it sat along important routes between the Forum and other parts of Rome. Even Julius Caesar spent his early years there. Yes, the future dictator of Rome grew up in one of the city's rougher neighbourhoods, which probably explains why he later seemed very comfortable navigating chaotic political situations. After surviving the Subura, the Roman Senate probably felt relaxing by comparison. The district had energy, opportunity, and constant movement. But it also had something else. Trouble. And if you were new to Rome, someone would eventually give you a simple piece of advice. If you must pass through the Subura, do it during the day, and keep walking. During the day, Rome was chaotic. At night, it became something else entirely, because once the sun went down, the city changed personality. Shops closed, respectable citizens returned home, and the streets slowly emptied. What remained was a much smaller group of people. Some of them were drunk, some of them were criminals, and some of them were both. One of the biggest problems was lighting. Ancient Rome did not have streetlights in the modern sense. Most streets were dark, especially in poorer neighbourhoods where nobody was particularly eager to spend money on public illumination. So after sunset, Walking through the city meant navigating narrow alleys and uneven roads with very little visibility, which criminals appreciated enormously. Roman writers frequently warned about the dangers of being out late. The poet Juvenal complained that walking through Rome at night required courage and a willingness to accept certain risks. Robbers could hide in doorways or alley corners and jump unsuspecting pedestrians. Street gangs sometimes roamed the darker districts, and drunken arguments could quickly turn into full-scale fights. If someone knocked you unconscious in a dark street, there was a good chance nobody would notice until morning. Even the hazards that were not criminal could still be unpleasant. For example, Roman apartment buildings often had a creative solution for garbage disposal. They threw it out the window. Food scraps, broken pottery, waste from cooking, and occasionally chamber pots were simply dumped into the street below, which meant walking at night involved an additional risk. Not only could you be robbed, but something unpleasant might fall from above without warning. Juvenal once joked that if you plan to walk through Rome after dark, you should write your will before leaving home. This may sound exaggerated, but the concern was real. Even wealthy Romans avoided travelling at night without servants or guards accompanying them. And if someone important absolutely had to move around the city after sunset, they usually travelled with a torchbearer and several companions, because the darker streets of Rome were unpredictable places. During the day, the city belonged to merchants, shoppers, and officials. At night, it belonged to everyone else, and everyone else was not always known for polite behaviour. If there is one thing every massive city in history has had in abundance, it is opportunity. Opportunity for merchants, opportunity for workers, and opportunity for criminals. Ancient Rome was no exception. With nearly 1 million people moving through crowded markets, festivals, temples, and streets every day, the city provided perfect working conditions for pickpockets and professional thieves. You could say Rome had a thriving service industry, just not the kind anyone requested. Crowds were everywhere. The Forum was packed with merchants and politicians. Markets bustled with shoppers. Public games at the Colosseum or Circus Maximus attracted tens of thousands of spectators. And where crowds gather, wallets disappear. Pickpockets were skilled at blending into the chaos. A quick bump, a distraction, a sudden shout from an accomplice, and suddenly your purse or coin pouch was no longer yours. By the time you realized what had happened, the thief was already 3 streets away. Roman writers regularly complained about these criminals. Martial joked about thieves who could steal so smoothly that the victim only noticed hours later. Which is impressive in a technical sense. Not helpful, but impressive. The problem was that enforcement was limited. Rome's security forces were small compared to the size of the city. Patrols existed, but they could not monitor every crowded street or market stall. That left plenty of room for creative entrepreneurship. Some thieves worked alone. Others operated in groups. Gangs developed systems where one person distracted the victim while another removed valuables. A third accomplice might immediately carry the stolen goods away to avoid being caught with evidence. It was teamwork, unethical teamwork, but still impressive coordination. Travellers were particularly vulnerable. Visitors often carried money, did not know the local streets, and could easily become targets, which meant arriving in Rome required some basic survival strategies. Keep valuables hidden, avoid obvious displays of wealth, and if someone suddenly bumped into you in a crowded alley, check your purse immediately, because while Rome was the centre of an empire, it was also the centre of a very active underground economy, and the professionals working in that industry were extremely good at their jobs. If the streets of Rome were chaotic during the day and dangerous at night, the taverns made sure the chaos never really stopped. These establishments were called popinae, and they were scattered throughout the poorer districts of the city. You could find them in places like the Subura, or along busy trade routes where travellers, labourers and soldiers needed somewhere to eat, drink, and temporarily forget about their problems. Popinae served cheap food and very cheap wine. The food might include bread, olives, lentils, sausages or stew, simmering in large pots. It was simple, filling, and usually eaten quickly while standing or sitting on rough benches. The wine, however, was a different story. Roman tavern wine had a reputation for being flexible. It was often watered down, mixed with herbs, or diluted in creative ways to stretch supplies. Sometimes tavern keepers added flavourings to hide the fact that the wine had been sitting around longer than anyone wanted to admit. If you ordered a drink, you were taking a small gamble. But then again, gambling was part of the entertainment. Inside many taverns you would find dice games in progress, with patrons betting small amounts of money or goods. Gambling was technically restricted under Roman law, but enforcement was inconsistent, which meant people gambled anyway. The atmosphere inside a popina could change quickly. At one table, merchants might be discussing business. At another, soldiers might be celebrating a recent payday. Nearby, gamblers argued loudly about whose dice were suspiciously lucky. Add alcohol to the situation, and arguments sometimes became fights. Roman writers often described taverns as noisy and morally questionable places. Respectable citizens claimed they avoided them entirely. This claim was probably optimistic, because despite their reputation, taverns were extremely popular. For many ordinary Romans, they were the closest thing to a social club. People met friends there, exchanged news, and relaxed after long days of work. Of course, relaxing occasionally turned into shouting. Shouting occasionally turned into fighting. And fighting occasionally turned into someone being escorted out the door. But that was simply part of tavern culture. If you walked into a popina expecting peace and quiet, you had misunderstood the purpose of the establishment. Popinae were places where Rome's rougher side gathered, and in the bad neighbourhoods of the city, they were rarely empty. If there was one pastime Romans loved almost as much as wine, it was gambling. Dice games were everywhere in the poorer districts of the city. In taverns, alleyways, markets, and even outside temples, groups of men gathered around small boards or flat stones, shaking dice and arguing loudly about luck, skill, and whose turn it actually was. Officially, gambling was restricted under Roman law. Unofficially, almost everyone ignored that rule unless a particularly strict official happened to be nearby. The game itself was simple. Players rolled dice and bet coins, small goods, or occasionally anything they happened to have on them. A few lucky rolls could turn a small wager into a decent amount of money. Unfortunately, luck was not always the main factor involved. Rome's gambling scene attracted a certain kind of professional, the hustler. These individuals had mastered the art of making a game appear fair while quietly tilting the odds in their favour. Some used weighted dice. Others relied on distraction, fast hands, or accomplices who pretended to be fellow players. If a newcomer arrived in a neighbourhood tavern looking curious and slightly wealthy, the hustlers would quickly welcome them to the game. Very warmly. For the first few rounds, the new player might even win. This helped build confidence and encouraged larger bets. Then the luck changed. Suddenly the dice behaved strangely. The newcomer lost one wager, then another, and another. By the time the player realised something was wrong, most of their money had quietly migrated across the table. And if they protested too loudly, the surrounding players might remind them that tavern disputes were not always resolved peacefully. Street hustlers also worked outside taverns. Some ran small betting games in busy markets where crowds gathered. Others operated shell games or quick wagers designed to separate impatient travellers from their coins. The trick was always the same. Move quickly. Confuse the victim. Disappear before anyone had time to think. Roman writers frequently mocked these gamblers and tricksters, but they were a normal part of city life. Because where crowds, money, and alcohol meet, someone is always ready to offer a friendly game. And in the bad neighbourhoods of Rome, those games rarely ended with everyone smiling. Crime made Rome dangerous. Fire made it terrifying. Because while thieves might steal your money, a fire could take everything you owned in a single night. Ancient Rome was extremely vulnerable to fires. The city was packed tightly with insular apartment buildings, many of which were built with wooden beams and flimsy materials. Kitchens used open flames for cooking, and oil lamps burned constantly for light. In other words, The entire city was basically one large accident waiting to happen. When a fire started in one building, it could spread quickly to the neighboring structures. The narrow streets and tightly packed rooftops allowed flames to jump from one building to the next, like an enthusiastic athlete in a relay race. Once that happened, entire blocks could ignite. The poor neighborhoods were especially vulnerable because the insulae there were often built quickly and cheaply. Landlords wanted to maximize rent income, which meant squeezing as many tenants as possible into limited space. Fire safety was not high on the priority list. Roman writers describe nights when flames suddenly appeared in a distant street, and within minutes the glow spread across the rooftops. Residents woke to shouting, smoke, and the frantic sound of people trying to escape. Imagine living on the 5th floor of a crowded apartment building when that happens. Staircases might already be filled with smoke. Neighbors were rushing downward in panic. Some residents tried climbing across rooftops to escape. Others grabbed whatever possessions they could carry and ran. Many simply fled with nothing. The Roman government eventually created a firefighting force known as the vigiles. These men patrolled the city at night and attempted to control fires when they broke out. Their tools were simple: buckets of water, pumps, hooks used to pull down burning structures, and a lot of shouting. Sometimes they managed to stop a fire before it spread too far. Sometimes they did not. Large fires were common enough that many Romans lived with a quiet understanding that one day their home might vanish in smoke. Which meant people in the poorer districts slept each night beside two possibilities: the sound of a thief in the alley, or the smell of smoke drifting through the window. By now you might be wondering whether Rome had any kind of police force. The answer is sort of. Rome's closest equivalent to nighttime law enforcement was a group called the vigiles. These men served as firefighters, night patrols, and general keepers of order after dark. Which sounds like a reasonable job description, until you remember that Rome had around 1 million people and a lot of narrow, chaotic streets. The vigils were divided into several units stationed across the city. They patrolled neighborhoods at night, carrying lanterns and basic equipment for fighting fires. Officially, their primary duty was fire prevention. Unofficially, they were also expected to deal with crimes, drunken brawls, suspicious activity, and the occasional citizen loudly insisting that someone had stolen their sandals. In other words, their responsibilities were broad, their resources were not. Imagine trying to keep order in the largest city of the ancient world with a few patrol groups, minimal lighting, and thousands of people who had spent the evening drinking questionable wine. It was not an easy task. When fires broke out, the vigiles were the first responders. They carried buckets, water pumps, axes, and hooks used to tear down burning structures before the flames could spread. If a building caught fire, the strategy sometimes involved demolishing nearby walls to create a barrier. This was effective. It was also extremely unpopular with the owners of those walls. The vigiles also acted as night patrols, watching for thieves or suspicious behaviour. If they encountered criminals in the act, they could detain them and bring them before Roman authorities. But criminals understood something important. The city was enormous, and the vigiles could not be everywhere. In the darker districts, thieves and street gangs often worked in areas where patrols rarely passed. Narrow alleys and crowded neighbourhoods provided plenty of hiding places. So while the vigiles did provide some protection, they could not eliminate the dangers of the city after dark. For ordinary Romans, the presence of the vigiles offered a small sense of reassurance, but not a guarantee, because in a city as large and restless as Rome, even a dedicated night watch could only do so much. And sometimes the safest strategy was still the simplest one: stay home after sunset. By this point, ancient Rome might sound like a city where the biggest problems were collapsing apartments, suspicious dice games, and the occasional airborne piece of garbage. But there was another layer to the chaos: street gangs. In the crowded neighbourhoods of Rome, groups of young men sometimes formed loose gangs that controlled specific streets or districts. These groups were not always organised in the modern sense, but they could still be dangerous. Some gangs operated as thieves or extortionists. Others simply enjoyed the entertainment value of starting fights. Political figures occasionally used gangs as well. During the late Roman Republic, Rival politicians hired groups of rough men to intimidate opponents, disrupt public meetings, or attack rival supporters. In other words, Roman politics sometimes resembled a bar fight with speeches. One famous example involved the political rivals Publius Clodius Pulcher and Titus Annius Milo. Their supporters regularly clashed in the streets, turning parts of Rome into something resembling a battlefield. Riots broke out. Buildings were damaged. At one point, the Roman Senate house itself was burned during the chaos, which is not the kind of incident you expect from a government meeting. But even outside major political conflicts, smaller fights were common in the rougher neighbourhoods. Taverns could become the starting point for arguments that spilled out into the streets. Drunken insults, gambling disputes, someone accidentally stepping on the wrong foot. In crowded districts where people lived close together and tempers were short, these arguments sometimes escalated quickly. Weapons were not always necessary. A group of angry men armed with fists, sticks, and enthusiasm could cause plenty of damage. Roman writers often complained about these disturbances, especially at night when street fights could break out unexpectedly. For an ordinary resident, avoiding trouble required awareness. You learned which alleys to avoid, which taverns had reputations for violence, and which groups of men on a street corner were best given a respectful amount of distance. Because while Rome was the capital of a vast empire, parts of the city could still feel like the frontier. And in those neighbourhoods, the rule was simple: mind your business, or be prepared to run. If you lived in one of Rome's rougher districts, there was one luxury you almost certainly did not have: silence. Ancient Rome was loud during the day, and somehow even louder at night. The crowded neighbourhoods were packed with shops, workshops, taverns, carts, animals, and thousands of people all trying to live their lives in very limited space. Which meant the soundtrack of the city never really stopped. At sunrise, the markets began waking up. Vendors shouted to attract customers, advertising bread, olives, fish, vegetables, and whatever else they were trying to sell that morning. Blacksmiths hammered metal in workshops. Carpenters sawed wood. Merchants argued loudly about prices. Carts rolled through the streets carrying goods from the docks or warehouses. The wooden wheels rattled loudly over the stone pavement, creating a constant grinding noise that echoed between the buildings. Donkeys brayed, dogs barked, and somewhere nearby, someone was almost certainly arguing with a neighbour. Because when thousands of people live close together, patience becomes a limited resource. Even at night, the noise rarely stopped. Taverns stayed open late, filled with gamblers, musicians, and patrons who believed volume was the best way to win an argument. Drinking songs drifted through the streets. Dice clattered on wooden tables. Occasional fights added their own dramatic sound effects. The poet Martial once joked that Rome was so noisy that even the dead would struggle to sleep there. And he was not entirely exaggerating. Upper floors of apartment buildings were especially miserable for light sleepers. Thin walls and wooden floors meant you could hear your neighbours talking, arguing, cooking, or moving furniture at all hours. If someone dropped something on the floor above you, the entire apartment might shake. In modern cities, people complain about traffic noise. In ancient Rome, traffic noise was just the beginning. Life in these neighbourhoods meant constant movement, constant shouting, and constant activity. Quiet evenings were rare. Peaceful sleep was rarer. But for many Romans, this chaos was simply normal life in the biggest city on earth. If Rome was the heart of the empire, its bad neighbourhoods were the heartbeat. Loud, fast, and impossible to ignore. If the noise of Rome's bad neighbourhoods was unforgettable, the smell was even harder to ignore. Because while the Romans were brilliant engineers who built aqueducts, roads, and enormous monuments, their system for dealing with everyday waste was less impressive. Rome did have sewers. The famous Cloaca Maxima drained parts of the city and carried water away toward the Tiber River. It was a remarkable piece of engineering for its time, but it did not solve every sanitation problem. Far from it. Most apartment buildings did not have indoor plumbing. Many residents used chamber pots inside their homes, especially in the upper floors of insulae. When the pots were full, the contents needed to go somewhere. Ideally, they would be emptied into public latrines or drains. In reality, some residents preferred a faster method: out the window. This practice was so common that Roman law actually addressed it. Regulations warned citizens not to throw dangerous objects or waste into the streets, especially from upper floors. The fact that laws existed tells us something important. People were doing it anyway. Walking down a Roman street meant navigating more than just crowds. You also had to watch your step carefully, because the pavement often contained a mixture of mud, animal droppings, spilled food, and other materials that nobody was eager to identify too closely. Add summer heat to the equation, and the smell could become overwhelming. Markets contributed their own scents. Fish stalls, butcher shops, and food vendors produced piles of organic waste that did not always disappear quickly. Animals wandered through the streets as well. Donkeys pulled carts, horses carried riders, and stray dogs searched for scraps. All of them left something behind. Ancient writers frequently complained about the smell of the city. The poet Martial joked about walking through certain districts and encountering odours so powerful they could almost knock a person unconscious. Which may sound exaggerated, but when thousands of people, animals, and businesses share crowded streets without modern sanitation, the results are not subtle. For residents of Rome's poorer neighbourhoods, this was simply part of daily life. You got used to it, or at least you tried to. Because while the empire proudly displayed its marble monuments to the world, the streets behind those monuments often told a different story. One that involved a lot less marble, and a lot more smell. At this point, ancient Rome might sound like a place where collapsing buildings, thieves, fires, noise, and unpleasant smells combined to create what modern real estate listings would generously call a lively neighbourhood. So, a reasonable question appears. Why did people stay? Why would anyone willingly live in these crowded, dangerous districts when the city clearly had nicer areas? The answer, as usual, was work. Rome was not just a capital city. It was the economic heart of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Goods from Spain, Egypt, Greece, North Africa, and the Near East flowed constantly through its markets, and those markets needed workers. Dock labourers unloaded ships along the Tiber River. Craftsmen produced tools, clothing, pottery, and furniture. Bakers supplied bread to thousands of customers every day. Blacksmiths hammered metal in noisy workshops. Street vendors sold fruit, wine, hot food, and whatever else people might buy while rushing through crowded streets. All of these jobs were located inside the busy districts of the city, which meant workers needed to live nearby. Moving far away might give you cleaner air and quieter nights, but it also meant longer travel times and fewer opportunities to earn money. For people living day to day, that was not a realistic option, so they stayed in the neighbourhoods where the action was. Over time, residents learned how to navigate the risks. You discovered which streets were safe and which alleys were better avoided after sunset. You recognised the local tavern owners and knew which places served decent wine and which ones were famous for fights. You kept valuables hidden and avoided displaying wealth in crowded areas. In short, you adapted. These neighbourhoods were not just dangerous places. They were also communities. Families lived there for generations. Neighbours knew one another. Shopkeepers recognised regular customers. Life might have been chaotic, but it was familiar. And familiarity creates comfort, even in difficult environments. For many Romans, the crowded districts were not temporary stops on the way to something better. They were home, a noisy, crowded, unpredictable home, but still home. For all their dangers, the rough neighbourhoods of Rome were not just places of poverty and crime. They were also places of opportunity, because wherever thousands of people gather together in crowded streets, money begins to move. Markets were everywhere. Small stalls lined the streets selling bread, olives, fruit, cooked meals, sandals, tools, and countless other goods. A clever merchant could build a steady business in these busy districts simply by placing a table in the right corner and shouting louder than the competition. And shouting was very much part of the job. Street vendors competed fiercely for attention. One might be selling hot sausages, another offered fresh bread. A third loudly claimed that his wine was the finest in the district, which may or may not have been accurate. For a passer-by, the street often felt like a living advertisement. But opportunity was not limited to merchants. Craftsmen also worked in these neighbourhoods. Blacksmiths forged tools and nails. Carpenters built furniture and carts. Potters shaped clay vessels used in kitchens across the city. Many workshops were located on the ground floors of insulae, with workers living just upstairs, which meant your commute was extremely short, possibly just one staircase. The same crowds that attracted thieves also attracted customers. A busy street guaranteed a steady flow of people who might buy food, tools, clothing, or services. In this sense, the bad neighbourhoods were the economic engine of Rome. They were messy, loud, and chaotic, but they were full of life. Ambitious individuals could rise through these environments. A successful merchant might eventually open a larger shop. A skilled craftsman could build a reputation that attracted wealthier clients. Even some wealthy Romans began their lives in humble districts before climbing the social ladder. The city offered possibilities. You just had to survive long enough to take advantage of them. And that survival required a mix of hard work, caution, and a healthy awareness of your surroundings. Because in Rome's busiest neighbourhoods, opportunity and danger often shared the same street, sometimes the same building, and occasionally the same tavern table, which made life exciting, but rarely predictable. When Roman emperors wanted to show the greatness of their empire, they did not take visitors into the Subura at midnight. They showed them the Forum. They showed them temples covered in marble, triumphal arches celebrating victories, and enormous public buildings designed to impress anyone who happened to be watching. This was the Rome of speeches, ceremonies, and statues. It was magnificent, but it was not the whole story. The real Rome, the one where most people lived, was something very different. It was the Rome of crowded apartment blocks where neighbours could hear each other through thin walls. The Rome of narrow streets filled with vendors, carts, stray animals, and arguments that could start over something as simple as spilled wine. It was a city where fires were a constant fear, where thieves worked quietly in busy crowds, and where walking home after dark required a certain amount of courage. At the same time, it was also a city full of energy. Markets buzzed with activity. Workshops produced goods used across the empire. Taverns filled with laughter, shouting, and occasionally furniture being thrown across the room. Families raised children in tiny apartments, while merchants built businesses just downstairs. Life in these neighbourhoods was chaotic, noisy, and unpredictable. But it was also human, because empires are not really built by emperors alone. They are built by ordinary people, bakers, carpenters, dock workers, shopkeepers, and countless others who keep a city alive day after day. The marble monuments might have represented Rome's power, but the crowded streets represented its reality. And if you truly wanted to understand what life in ancient Rome was like, you would not spend all your time admiring statues in the Forum. You would walk through the neighbourhoods where people actually lived, preferably during daylight, and preferably while keeping one hand firmly on your wallet. Because while Rome ruled the world, its streets still operated by a very simple rule: stay alert, or someone else might help themselves to your belongings. Long before vampires became handsome immortals in velvet cloaks, the people of Eastern Europe imagined something far less glamorous. Their vampires were not mysterious aristocrats with pale skin and poetic voices. They were swollen, decaying corpses that refused to stay where they belonged, underground. In the villages scattered across regions like Transylvania, Wallachia, Serbia, and Bulgaria, death did not always mean peace. People believed that under certain circumstances the dead could return. Not as ghosts, drifting harmlessly through walls, but as something much worse. These creatures were called revenants, bodies that physically rose from their graves and walked again. To the villagers, This was not folklore or entertainment. It was a real danger. A typical story began with a death that seemed ordinary enough. Someone in the village passed away after illness, an accident, or sometimes no clear reason at all. The body was buried according to local customs, prayers were spoken, and life continued. But then strange things started happening. Livestock might grow weak overnight. Dogs barked endlessly at empty roads. A neighbour who had been perfectly healthy suddenly fell sick and died within days. Soon whispers began to circulate. Someone would say they saw a shadow moving through the cemetery at night. Another claimed they heard scratching beneath the earth. And before long, the worst suspicion emerged. The dead person had become a vampire. Once that idea took hold, fear spread quickly. Villagers believed the risen corpse returned to its former home first, sometimes knocking on the door or standing silently outside windows. Those who encountered it often became ill soon afterward, as if their life was slowly being drained away. Descriptions of these vampires were disturbing. Unlike modern myths, they were not skeletal or dried out. People claimed the bodies looked strangely fresh. Their skin appeared stretched and reddish. Their stomachs were bloated, as if they had been feeding. Sometimes blood was said to seep from the mouth. To terrified villagers, these were clear signs that the corpse had been leaving the grave at night. Today we understand that many of these signs were simply natural stages of decomposition. But medieval villagers had no knowledge of that process. What they saw looked like proof that the dead were very much alive. And so, a chilling question haunted countless villages across Eastern Europe. If someone truly had risen from the grave, how could they be stopped? In medieval Eastern Europe, villagers believed the dead rarely rose without warning. According to local superstition, certain people were practically destined to become vampires long before they ever reached the grave. And medieval villagers, always eager to avoid a blood-drinking neighbour, kept a suspicious eye out for the signs. Some of these supposed warnings began at birth. A baby born with teeth, for example, was considered deeply troubling. Medieval midwives might whisper to each other while examining the infant's mouth, quietly wondering whether the child had arrived in the world already halfway connected to the realm of the undead. Extra nipples were another ominous mark, sometimes called a devil's teat, which supposedly allowed dark spirits to feed from the body. Being born with a caul, a thin membrane covering the head, could also make villagers uneasy. While some cultures viewed it as lucky, others feared it meant the child would someday return from the grave. Even behaviour during life could raise suspicions. People who were considered antisocial, strange, or unusually aggressive might be quietly labelled as future vampires. A person who talked to themselves, wandered alone at night, or kept unusual habits might find neighbours whispering behind their backs. In small medieval villages, reputation was everything, and once suspicion took hold, it could follow someone all the way to their funeral. Certain deaths were considered particularly dangerous as well. Someone who died suddenly, violently, or without proper religious rites might become a restless corpse. Suicide victims, criminals, and people believed to have practiced witchcraft were especially feared after death. Without the protection of sacred rituals, villagers believed their spirits could not rest peacefully. Animals also played a role in identifying potential vampires. If a cat or dog jumped over a corpse before burial, that body was sometimes believed to be contaminated with dark forces. To modern ears, this may sound absurd, but medieval villagers lived in a world where animals were thought to sense supernatural dangers invisible to humans. Even physical appearance after death could spark fear. If a corpse looked unusually healthy, with rosy skin or full lips, villagers might panic. Rather than seeing natural decomposition processes, they interpreted these signs as evidence the corpse had been feeding on the living. And once that suspicion began, the village would not simply wait and see. Preventing a vampire was considered far safer than dealing with one after it had already risen. Once a villager was suspected of becoming a vampire, the community did not simply hope for the best. Medieval Eastern Europeans believed it was far wiser to prevent the dead from rising in the first place. And so, over centuries, villages developed a strange but elaborate collection of protective rituals meant to keep corpses exactly where they belonged. buried. One of the most famous protections was garlic. Long before modern horror stories popularized the idea, garlic had a deep reputation as a powerful defense against evil forces. Villagers hung garlic cloves above doors and windows, believing the strong smell repelled supernatural creatures. Some families even placed garlic inside the mouth of a corpse before burial, ensuring that if the body tried to rise, the pungent barrier would drive it back. Iron objects were also believed to possess protective power. In many villages, small iron nails or knives were placed inside coffins or hammered into the ground above graves. Iron had long been associated with strength and purity, and many cultures believed it could repel dark spirits. To medieval villagers, placing iron near a corpse was like locking the door of the grave. Sometimes stones were placed inside the mouth of the deceased. The logic was simple and slightly horrifying. If the corpse attempted to feed on the living, the stone would prevent it from biting. Archaeologists have actually discovered several medieval burials in Eastern Europe where stones or bricks were carefully positioned between the teeth of the dead, suggesting these fears were taken very seriously. Other rituals involved the positioning of the body itself. In certain regions, corpses were buried face down. The reasoning was almost darkly practical. If the vampire tried to dig its way out, it would only dig deeper into the earth instead of climbing toward the surface. Religious protections were also common. Priests blessed graves, crosses were placed over burial sites, and holy water might be sprinkled over the body before the coffin was sealed. Christianity had spread widely through Eastern Europe by the medieval period, and many vampire beliefs blended older pagan fears with newer religious practices. But despite all these precautions, sometimes villagers still believed something had gone terribly wrong. When sickness spread through a village, or unexplained deaths began to occur, suspicion often returned to the graveyard. And when fear reached that point, the villagers sometimes made a decision that would horrify modern observers. They opened the grave. For medieval villagers in Eastern Europe, suspicion of a vampire did not remain a quiet rumour for long. When illness began spreading through a community, or when several deaths occurred in quick succession, fear often pointed toward the cemetery. And once villagers believed the dead were responsible, there was only one way to confirm it. They dug up the grave. These exhumations were not secret acts carried out by a single frightened individual. Often the entire village participated. Local officials, priests, and family members sometimes gathered together at the burial site, determined to uncover the truth. To them, this was not desecration. It was a desperate attempt to protect the living. When the coffin was opened, everyone looked for specific signs that supposedly proved the corpse had become a vampire. One of the most common signs was a body that appeared strangely well preserved. If the corpse had not visibly decayed or if the skin looked fresh and reddish, villagers believed it meant the body had been leaving the grave at night to feed on blood. In reality, this appearance was simply part of normal decomposition. As gases build inside the body, the skin can stretch and discolour, giving the corpse a swollen, almost lifelike look. But medieval villagers had no scientific explanation for what they were seeing. Blood around the mouth was another terrifying discovery. During decomposition, fluids can leak from the nose or mouth. To frightened villagers, however, this looked exactly like evidence of a recent meal. Even the growth of hair or nails could alarm observers. As the skin dries and shrinks after death, nails and hair appear longer than they were during life. But villagers interpreted this as proof that the body was still growing, another sign that the corpse was somehow alive. Sometimes the coffin itself seemed disturbed. If the body had shifted position, villagers believed the vampire had been moving during the night. Once the corpse was declared a vampire, the village rarely hesitated. They believed immediate action was necessary before the creature returned to harm more people. The methods used to destroy the vampire varied from place to place, but they were always brutal. And among those methods, one solution became legendary across Eastern Europe: the wooden stake. Once a corpse was declared a vampire, the villagers wasted no time. Fear had already spread through the community, and every unexplained illness or death seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. If the creature in the grave truly was feeding on the living, then the only solution was to destroy it before it returned again. The most famous method, and the one that would later dominate vampire legends across the world, was the wooden stake. In many parts of Eastern Europe, villagers believed that driving a sharpened stake through the vampire's body would pin it permanently to the earth. The stake was usually aimed at the heart, though the exact location varied depending on local traditions. Some regions preferred the chest, others the stomach, and in certain areas the stake was hammered directly through the throat. The act itself was grim and terrifying. A group of villagers gathered around the opened grave while someone, often a strong man or local executioner, held the stake in place. Another person would swing a heavy hammer or mallet, driving the wood downward with force. Witnesses sometimes reported strange sounds coming from the corpse during this process. As gases trapped inside the body escaped, the corpse might release a groaning noise or force air from the lungs. To medieval villagers, this was chilling proof that the vampire had been alive until the very moment the stake struck. But the staking did not always end the ritual. In some villages, the corpse was also decapitated after being staked. The head might be placed between the legs of the body or buried separately. This was believed to confuse the vampire, preventing it from finding its way back to the world of the living. Fire was another common solution. Burning the corpse ensured that nothing could rise again. The ashes might then be scattered far from the village, sometimes thrown into rivers, so the remains could never return. While these practices may sound extreme, they were carried out with genuine fear and conviction. Villagers believed they were protecting their families, their livestock, and their entire community from a deadly supernatural threat. Over time, stories of these rituals spread across Europe. Travellers carried the tales westward, where writers and scholars recorded them with fascination and horror. And eventually, these strange village traditions would help create one of the most famous monsters in history, the vampire. Even after a vampire had been staked, many villagers believed the danger was not completely over. Medieval superstition often treated vampires as stubborn creatures, capable of returning unless the body was destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. Because of this, staking was sometimes only the beginning of the ritual. The next step could be even more dramatic: burning the corpse. Fire was widely believed to purify evil forces. In many cultures across Europe, flames symbolized cleansing and final destruction. If a body suspected of vampirism was burned, villagers believed its dark power would vanish completely. Nothing could rise from ashes. Once a grave had been opened and the corpse declared a vampire, villagers sometimes dragged the body out of the cemetery entirely. It might be carried to an open field or a clearing outside the village. There, a large fire was prepared using wood gathered from nearby forests. The body was placed on the pyre and the flames were lit. Accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries describe these events with disturbing detail. Crowds sometimes gathered to witness the burning, watching carefully as the corpse was consumed by fire. To them, this was not cruelty, but protection. Every crackling flame meant the end of the vampire's power. In certain traditions, the ritual did not stop once the body had burned. Villagers collected the ashes and scattered them far away from the burial site. Some were thrown into rivers so the water would carry them downstream. Others were buried in separate locations, ensuring that no single grave could serve as a place of return. A particularly strange practice appears in some historical records. After burning the body, villagers sometimes mixed a small portion of the ashes into water or wine and made the surviving family members drink it. This was believed to cure anyone who had already been attacked by the vampire, almost like a grim form of medicine. To modern readers, these customs seem brutal and deeply unsettling. But for medieval villagers, they represented desperate attempts to regain control over mysterious diseases and sudden deaths that had no clear explanation. Without knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or the true causes of epidemics, communities searched for answers wherever they could find them. And sometimes the easiest explanation was the most terrifying one. The dead had returned, Long before villagers resorted to digging up graves and hammering stakes into corpses, many communities tried to prevent vampires from rising in the first place. Across Eastern Europe, strange burial rituals developed over centuries, each designed to keep the dead safely confined beneath the earth. Some of these methods were surprisingly creative. One common practice involved placing heavy objects on top of the corpse. Stones, bricks, or even large slabs of rock were positioned on the chest or inside the coffin. The reasoning was straightforward. If the body attempted to rise during the night, the weight would hold it down. Archaeologists have discovered several medieval graves where bricks were carefully placed inside the mouth of the deceased. In places like Bulgaria and Poland, skeletons have been found with stones wedged between their jaws. Villagers believed this prevented the corpse from biting or feeding on the living. In other words, even if the vampire managed to rise, it would be unable to attack anyone. Some communities used sickles or iron blades placed across the neck of the corpse. If the body tried to sit up, the blade would cut through the throat. It was a grim but effective form of supernatural insurance. Another unusual practice involved tying the limbs of the deceased. Hands and feet were sometimes bound with rope or cloth before burial. The goal was simple: limit the corpse's ability to move. If the vampire could not walk, it could not wander through the village at night. Burial orientation also mattered. In certain regions, suspected vampires were buried face down. Villagers believed that if the corpse awakened, it would instinctively dig downward rather than upward, sending itself deeper into the ground instead of escaping. Seeds and grains sometimes played a role as well. Poppy seeds or millet might be scattered inside the coffin or across the grave. According to superstition, vampires were compelled to stop and count every grain they encountered. By the time they finished this tedious task, dawn would arrive, forcing them back into the grave. These rituals might sound bizarre today, but they reveal something important about medieval life. Communities were trying to control a threat they did not understand. Disease, sudden death, and unexplained illness created fear, and burial customs became a way to fight back. Yet even the most careful rituals could not completely erase the fear that something might still be waiting beneath the soil. And sometimes, the villagers believed they had proof. Vampire superstitions in Eastern Europe were not just quiet folklore shared around fires. At times, these beliefs exploded into full outbreaks of panic. Entire villages became convinced that the dead were rising. And once that fear took hold, the consequences could be dramatic. One of the most famous waves of vampire hysteria occurred during the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in regions of Serbia and the Habsburg Empire. In these areas, reports of vampires became so widespread that even government officials and military officers began documenting the strange events. A typical outbreak often began with unexplained deaths. Someone in the village would die suddenly, followed soon by another death, and then another. Without modern medicine, people had little understanding of disease. Epidemics such as tuberculosis, rabies, or plague could spread silently through communities, claiming victims one after another. To villagers, however, the pattern looked suspiciously supernatural. Many believed the first person to die had returned from the grave and was feeding on the living. Survivors sometimes claimed to see the dead person walking at night or appearing in dreams. Others described feelings of suffocation while sleeping, which they interpreted as a vampire sitting on their chest and draining their life. Once rumours began spreading, panic could escalate quickly. Graves were opened, bodies were examined, and suspected vampires were destroyed using the rituals people trusted: staking, burning, or decapitation. One particularly famous case occurred in 18th century Serbia, involving a man named Petar Blagojević. After his death, several villagers reportedly died soon afterward, claiming before their deaths that Petar had visited them during the night. Local authorities were summoned, and when Petar's grave was opened, witnesses claimed his body appeared unusually fresh. Terrified villagers drove a stake through his heart and burned the body. Another case involved Arnold Pajola, a Serbian soldier who reportedly believed he had been attacked by a vampire earlier in his life. After Paul died in an accident, villagers claimed he returned from the grave to attack others. Once again, officials investigated, exhumed the body, and carried out vampire-destroying rituals. These reports spread across Europe through newspapers and government records. Scholars, priests, and physicians began debating the strange phenomenon. For the first time, the question of vampires was no longer just a village superstition. It had become a topic of international fascination. By the 18th century, stories of vampires had travelled far beyond the frightened villages where they first took shape. Reports from Eastern Europe, especially the dramatic cases of suspected vampires in Serbia and surrounding regions, spread through newspapers, military reports, and letters written by government officials. Suddenly, the strange traditions of rural communities were being discussed in the intellectual circles of Europe. Scholars, doctors, and priests began debating whether vampires could truly exist. Many educated Europeans were skeptical. Physicians who examined the reports tried to explain the supposed vampire signs using natural causes. They pointed out that the swollen bodies villagers described were simply the result of decomposition. Blood appearing around the mouth was caused by fluids escaping as the body decayed. Hair and nails did not grow after death. The skin merely shrank, making them appear longer. But despite these rational explanations, the stories were simply too fascinating to ignore. Writers and philosophers discussed vampire cases in pamphlets and essays. The idea of the undead captured the imagination of a continent already fascinated by mystery, folklore, and the supernatural. Soon, the vampire began to transform from a rural fear into something larger, a creature of legend. During the 19th century, authors started reshaping the vampire story. Instead of the bloated, horrifying corpse feared by Eastern European villagers, writers imagined something far more dramatic. The vampire became intelligent, seductive, and aristocratic, a dark figure who moved through society rather than clawing out of muddy graves. One of the earliest famous vampire stories was The Vampire, written in 1818 by John Polidori. In this tale, the vampire appeared as a mysterious nobleman, charming and dangerous. Later in the century, another writer would create the most famous vampire of all, Count Dracula. Bram Stoker's novel, published in 1897, drew inspiration from Eastern European folklore, but reshaped it into a Gothic masterpiece. Dracula was not a mindless revenant wandering through farmland. He was an ancient count living in a dark castle, commanding supernatural powers and terrifying the modern world. From that moment on, the vampire was no longer just a village superstition. It had become one of the most enduring monsters in human storytelling, a creature born from fear, misunderstanding, and centuries of strange burial rituals in the villages of Eastern Europe. Justina Szilágyi was born into one of the most influential noble families in 15th century Hungary, a world shaped by constant political tension, border wars, and shifting alliances between kingdoms. Although the details of her early life remain scarce, her family name alone tells us a great deal about the environment in which she grew up. The Szilágyi family stood close to the centre of Hungarian power. They were not minor nobles living quietly on distant estates. They were deeply connected to the political elite who shaped the fate of the region. Their influence reached into the royal court itself, particularly through their connection to Matthias Corvinus, the powerful king of Hungary. Justina's uncle, Michael Szilágyi, was a major political figure and military commander who helped secure the throne for Matthias Corvinus in the mid-15th century. The Szilágyi family therefore moved within circles where politics, warfare, and diplomacy were daily realities. Growing up in such a household meant learning early how fragile power could be. Noblewomen in this world were rarely given public authority, but they still played important roles behind the scenes. From a young age, Justina would likely have been trained in the expectations of aristocratic life. She would have learned how to manage a household, oversee servants, and represent her family with dignity and discipline. Education for noblewomen often included reading religious texts, basic literacy in Latin or Hungarian, and knowledge of courtly etiquette. A noblewoman's behavior reflected directly on her entire family, so composure and intelligence were highly valued, but perhaps the most important aspect of her life would have been marriage. For aristocratic families, marriage was not primarily about romance. It was about alliances, loyalty, and power. Marriages connected powerful houses together and strengthened political networks across borders. A carefully arranged marriage could stabilize an alliance or secure a strategic relationship with a neighboring ruler. At some point during the mid-15th century, Justina Szilágyi became part of one such alliance. She married Vlad the Impaler, the controversial ruler of Wallachia, who would later become one of the most feared figures in European history. Vlad's reputation for brutal punishments and impalements would eventually echo through centuries of legend. But when Justina entered his life, she was not stepping into a legend. She was stepping into a court ruled by constant danger, political intrigue, and a man whose enemies feared him across all of Eastern Europe. Justina Szilágyi's marriage to Vlad the Impaler placed her at the center of one of the most dangerous courts in Eastern Europe. Vlad, also known as Vlad III of Wallachia, ruled a small but fiercely contested principality located between powerful forces. To the north stood the Kingdom of Hungary. To the south stretched the vast and expanding Ottoman Empire. Wallachia existed constantly under pressure, its rulers forced to navigate alliances, betrayals, and war. Vlad himself had already lived a dramatic and violent life before marrying Justina. As a young boy, he had been taken as a hostage to the Ottoman court, a political arrangement meant to guarantee the loyalty of his father. There he witnessed the power of the Ottoman Empire and absorbed the harsh realities of survival in a world ruled by ruthless politics. When he eventually returned to claim the throne of Wallachia, he ruled with an iron hand. His reputation quickly spread across Europe. Vlad became famous and infamous for his brutal punishments. The most notorious was impalement, a method of execution that involved placing victims on tall wooden stakes. Whether enemies, criminals, or political rivals, those who opposed him could expect little mercy. Yet for all his brutality, Vlad also maintained strong connections with Hungary. The Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus, saw Vlad as a valuable ally against the Ottomans. This political relationship likely played a role in Vlad's marriage to Justina Szilágyi. Her powerful family ties strengthened the alliance between Vlad and the Hungarian court. For Justina, this marriage meant leaving the familiar world of Hungarian aristocratic life and entering the volatile court of Wallachia. The environment there was far less stable than the royal court of Hungary. Wallachian rulers were constantly threatened by internal rebellions, rival claimants to the throne, and foreign invasions. Life in Vlad's court would have required constant caution. Noble families competed for influence, and loyalty could shift quickly. Justina would have needed to navigate these tensions carefully, maintaining her dignity while supporting her husband's rule. Unfortunately, historical sources tell us very little about her daily life during this time. Medieval records often focused on kings, battles, and political treaties, leaving the experiences of noblewomen largely unrecorded. But even without detailed accounts, one thing is certain. Justina Szilágyi lived beside one of the most feared rulers of the 15th century in a court where power, violence, and survival were closely intertwined. Living in the court of Vlad the Impaler meant existing in a world shaped by constant tension. Wallachia in the 15th century was not a peaceful kingdom with stable borders and predictable politics. It was a frontier state caught between larger powers, and its rulers often survived only through a mixture of intimidation, military strength, and political maneuvering. For Justina Szilágyi, arriving at Vlad's court would have meant adjusting quickly to this harsh environment. The Wallachian court was smaller and less ceremonious than the grand royal courts of Western Europe. Instead of lavish halls filled with musicians and elaborate ceremonies, Vlad's court likely centered around fortified residences, military councils, and urgent political discussions. The ruler of Wallachia could never afford to appear weak. Authority had to be displayed constantly. Vlad cultivated that authority with ruthless precision, Stories about his punishments circulated widely even during his lifetime. Criminals, traitors, and enemies were often executed in brutal ways, the most infamous being impalement. Rows of wooden stakes bearing the bodies of executed prisoners were sometimes placed outside towns as a warning to anyone who might challenge his rule. For visitors and diplomats, these displays were meant to send a very clear message. Wallachia was ruled by a man who would not hesitate to use fear as a weapon. What Justina thought of these actions is impossible to know. Medieval sources rarely recorded the private opinions of noblewomen. Yet, as Vlad's wife, she would have been closely associated with his rule and the court he controlled. Her responsibilities likely followed the traditional role of a noble consort. She would have overseen household management, supervised servants, and possibly acted as a diplomatic presence when foreign envoys arrived. Noblewomen often played quiet but important roles in maintaining alliances and social connections. Court life also meant constant awareness of danger. Wallachia's throne was frequently contested, and rulers were sometimes overthrown or assassinated by rival factions. Noble families within the region often shifted loyalties depending on political circumstances. In such an environment, trust was fragile. While Vlad projected power and fear toward his enemies, those within his court had to navigate a delicate balance of loyalty and survival. For Justina Szilágyi, every day at court would have unfolded under the shadow of political uncertainty. And soon, events beyond Wallachia's borders would begin to reshape both Vlad's fate and her own. During the time Justina Szilágyi lived beside Vlad the Impaler, Wallachia stood directly on the fault line between Christian Europe and the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had already conquered vast territories across the Balkans, and their armies continued to push northward. For Wallachia, this meant living under the constant threat of invasion. Vlad the Impaler built his rule largely around resisting that threat. He understood that his small principality could not match the Ottomans in sheer numbers. Instead, he relied on brutal tactics meant to intimidate enemies and discourage rebellion at home. Vlad's methods were not just about punishment, they were psychological warfare. If enemies believed that entering Wallachia meant facing unimaginable cruelty, they might think twice before advancing. One of the most famous episodes of this conflict came during Vlad's campaign against the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the same ruler who had conquered Constantinople only a few years earlier. Mehmed's armies marched toward Wallachia, determined to remove Vlad from power and replace him with a more obedient ruler. Vlad responded with unconventional tactics. Rather than confronting the Ottoman army in open battle, he launched nighttime raids and surprise attacks. One of the most legendary incidents occurred during a daring night assault on the Ottoman camp, where Vlad and his soldiers attempted to strike directly at the Sultan himself. Although the attack failed to kill Mehmed, it created chaos and demonstrated Vlad's willingness to take extreme risks. The psychological impact of his rule became clear when Ottoman forces advanced deeper into Wallachia. According to chroniclers, they encountered fields filled with impaled prisoners, thousands of bodies displayed on wooden stakes. These gruesome scenes were meant to send a message. Any invader entering Vlad's lands would face terrifying consequences. For Justina Szilágyi, these years must have been filled with uncertainty. While Vlad led campaigns and defended his territory, the court remained vulnerable to sudden political changes. A ruler who fought powerful enemies also risked attracting powerful retaliation. Wallachia's position between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire meant that its ruler constantly depended on alliances for survival. Vlad's relationship with the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus was particularly important. But alliances in medieval politics were rarely permanent. Soon, the relationship between Vlad and Hungary would take a dramatic and unexpected turn, one that would alter the course of Justina's life as well. Despite Vlad the Impaler's fierce resistance against the Ottoman Empire, his position eventually became unstable. By the early 1660s of the 15th century, pressure from multiple sides began to weaken his rule. Ottoman forces continued to threaten Wallachia, and internal rivals sought opportunities to replace him on the throne. In such a dangerous political landscape, Vlad relied heavily on the support of Hungary and its powerful king, Matthias Corvinus. Hungary had long viewed Wallachia as a strategic buffer against Ottoman expansion, and Vlad had presented himself as a fierce defender of Christian Europe. For years, this alliance allowed him to continue ruling. But medieval politics could shift quickly. At some point during the conflict with the Ottomans, Vlad travelled toward Hungary, hoping to secure military assistance from King Matthias. Instead of receiving the support he expected, something surprising happened. Vlad was suddenly arrested and imprisoned by the Hungarian king. The reasons behind this decision remain debated by historians. Some sources suggest that Matthias Corvinus received letters that appeared to show Vlad negotiating secretly with the Ottoman Sultan. If true, such negotiations would have looked like betrayal. Other historians believe these letters were forged by Vlad's enemies in order to remove him from power. Still others argue that Matthias may have simply found Vlad politically inconvenient and decided it was easier to imprison him than continue supporting his controversial rule. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Vlad the Impaler was taken into custody and held under Hungarian control for many years. For Justina Szilágyi, this sudden shift must have been dramatic. As the wife of a ruler, her position had depended entirely on Vlad's power. Once he was imprisoned, her life entered a far more uncertain phase. The court of Wallachia no longer revolved around her husband, and rival factions soon competed for control of the principality. Some historical accounts suggest that Vlad was eventually treated less like a prisoner and more like a noble kept under supervision within Hungary. During this period he remained connected to Hungarian aristocratic circles, which may have allowed his marriage to Justina to continue. Yet the situation was far from stable. For years Vlad remained unable to reclaim his throne, while the political balance in Wallachia continued to change. The man once feared across Europe was now a captive ruler, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. And for Justina Szilágyi, life beside Vlad had entered an entirely new chapter, one defined not by power, but by uncertainty. After Vlad the Impaler was taken into custody by the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, his life changed dramatically. The feared ruler who had once commanded armies and terrified enemies now spent years living under the watchful eye of the Hungarian court. While he was technically a prisoner, his captivity appears to have been somewhat unusual. Unlike a common criminal locked in a dungeon, Vlad was reportedly kept in conditions more fitting for a nobleman. Some accounts suggest he lived in royal fortresses or noble residences, remaining under supervision but still connected to the aristocratic world around him. In many ways, his captivity was political, rather than purely punitive. For Justina Szilágyi, this period likely meant remaining within Hungary as well, surrounded by her own powerful relatives and familiar cultural environment. This was very different from the unstable and dangerous court of Wallachia she had previously inhabited. The Hungarian court of Matthias Corvinus was one of the most sophisticated in Central Europe at the time. Matthias was known as a patron of learning and culture, building a famous library known as the Bibliotheca Corviniana and inviting scholars from across Europe. The royal court attracted diplomats, military leaders, and intellectuals who contributed to a lively political and cultural atmosphere. Within this environment, Justina's noble background would have helped her maintain a respected position. The Szilágyi family remained influential in Hungarian politics, and their connection to the king likely protected her from the instability that often followed the downfall of a ruler. Meanwhile, Vlad waited. During these years, his reputation continued to spread across Europe. German pamphlets circulated stories about his brutal punishments and violent rule. Some depicted him as a terrifying tyrant who delighted in cruelty. Others portrayed him as a ruthless defender of Christian lands against the Ottoman Empire. These conflicting portrayals helped turn Vlad into a larger-than-life figure, even while he remained confined. For Justina, the situation must have been complex. Her husband's name was becoming famous across Europe, but not always in a positive way. The man she had married was now a controversial figure, surrounded by dark legends and political rumours. Yet the story of Vlad the Impaler was not finished. Political circumstances were shifting once again, and powerful leaders in Hungary began reconsidering their strategy in the struggle against the Ottoman Empire. Soon, Vlad would be given another chance to return to Wallachia, and with that opportunity, both his fate and Justina's life would change once more. After years spent under Hungarian supervision, Vlad the Impaler eventually received another opportunity to reclaim the throne of Wallachia. By the mid-1670s of the 15th century, the political situation in Eastern Europe had shifted once again. The Ottoman Empire remained a constant threat, and the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus needed strong allies along the frontier. Vlad, despite his controversial reputation, was still known as a determined opponent of Ottoman expansion. For the Hungarian court, placing him back on the Wallachian throne could help strengthen the region's defences. With Hungarian support, Vlad prepared to return. The path back to power was not simple. Wallachia had seen several rulers come and go during his absence. Rival claimants supported by different factions competed for control of the principality, and the political landscape was unstable. Reclaiming the throne meant confronting both internal enemies and outside pressure from the Ottomans. Eventually, Vlad succeeded in retaking the throne in 1676 of the 15th century. But his third reign would be very different from the earlier periods of his rule. For one thing, it was extremely short. Wallachia remained caught between powerful forces, and the struggle for control of the region had not disappeared during Vlad's years in captivity. Rival nobles, shifting alliances, and Ottoman influence all continued to shape the fragile balance of power. During this final return to the throne, Vlad attempted once again to assert control and stabilize his rule. Yet the circumstances surrounding his leadership were far more precarious than before. His earlier campaigns and brutal methods had earned him both loyal supporters and determined enemies. For Justina Szilágyi, these events would have carried enormous personal consequences. If she accompanied Vlad back to Wallachia, she would have returned to a land filled with political dangers and unresolved rivalries. The court she had once known was now even more unstable than before. The years of conflict and shifting leadership had left the principality deeply divided. Unfortunately, historical sources provide very little detail about Justina's role during this final phase of Vlad's life. Like many noblewomen of the medieval period, her experiences were rarely recorded in official chronicles. What we do know is that Vlad's final reign did not last long. Within a short time, violence would once again overtake the Wallachian throne, bringing Vlad's turbulent life to an abrupt and dramatic end. Vlad the Impaler's final return to power in Wallachia was brief and unstable. After years spent away from the throne, the political situation he returned to was far more dangerous than before. Rival claimants, internal factions among the Wallachian nobles, and the looming influence of the Ottoman Empire all created a fragile balance that could collapse at any moment. It did not take long for that collapse to arrive. In the winter of 1676 of the 15th century, Vlad was killed during a conflict that remains partly mysterious even today. Historical sources disagree on exactly how his death occurred, but most accounts agree that it happened during a military confrontation involving forces loyal to his enemies. One common version of the story suggests Vlad was killed in battle against Ottoman-backed forces attempting to remove him from power once again. The fighting was chaotic, and Vlad, who often led his troops personally, may have been cut down during the clash. Another version suggests something even more dramatic. According to some reports, Vlad may have been killed by his own soldiers by mistake during the confusion of battle. Medieval warfare often involved poor communication and chaotic movements, making such accidents possible. Whatever the exact circumstances, Vlad's death ended one of the most notorious reigns in Eastern European history. The aftermath added yet another layer of legend to his story. Some reports claim that his head was severed after his death and sent to the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II as proof that the feared ruler had finally been defeated. The Sultan supposedly displayed the head publicly in Constantinople to demonstrate that the man who had resisted Ottoman power was gone. As for Vlad's body, its burial place remains uncertain. Some historians believe he was buried in a monastery in Wallachia, while others argue that the exact location of his grave is still unknown. For Justina Szilágyi, Vlad's death must have marked a profound turning point. As the widow of a controversial and feared ruler, her position would have changed dramatically. The power that once surrounded her life disappeared with Vlad's fall, and the political world of Wallachia moved on quickly to the next struggle for control. Unfortunately, the historical record grows almost silent about her life after this moment. Like many women of the medieval aristocracy, she fades from the chronicles just as the story reaches its most dramatic point. Yet her life had been lived beside one of the most infamous figures of the 15th century. After the violent end of Vlad the Impaler, the historical trail surrounding Justina Szilágyi becomes faint and uncertain. Medieval chronicles that eagerly recorded wars, executions, and political struggles rarely showed the same interest in the private lives of noble women. Once Vlad disappeared from the stage of history, Justina's story slipped quietly into the shadows. Yet the silence itself tells us something about the world she lived in. In the 15th century, a noblewoman's identity was closely tied to the power of the men around her. As the wife of a ruling prince, Justina had once stood beside one of the most feared figures in Eastern Europe. But when that ruler fell, the political attention of chroniclers shifted quickly to the next contender for the throne of Wallachia. Life for Vlad's widow likely returned to Hungary, where her powerful Szilágyi family still held influence. Unlike Wallachia, Hungary offered a more stable political environment and a court where her relatives remained respected figures. Returning there would have provided both safety and familiarity. The Szilágyi family continued to play roles within Hungarian aristocratic society for many years, and their connection to King Matthias Corvinus ensured that their name retained prestige. Within this environment, Justina would no longer have been the consort of a controversial ruler, but rather a member of a well-established noble house. It is possible that she lived the rest of her life quietly within this world, managing estates or remaining close to relatives within the Hungarian nobility. Medieval noblewomen often oversaw land holdings, supervised household administration, and maintained family alliances through correspondence and diplomacy. What makes Justina's story particularly intriguing is how closely it brushed against legend. Her husband's name would eventually become one of the most famous in European folklore. Centuries after his death, Vlad the Impaler would inspire the fictional vampire Count Dracula, turning the brutal Wallachian ruler into a symbol of Gothic horror known across the world. But Justina herself remained outside that legend. She was not remembered as a character in dark tales or supernatural stories. Instead, she existed in the quieter space of history, a noble woman who lived beside a man whose reputation would echo through centuries. Her life reminds us that behind many famous historical figures stood individuals whose stories were rarely recorded, yet whose lives were deeply shaped by the same dramatic events. In the ancient world, writing was one of the most powerful tools a person could possess. Through writing, rulers issued laws, priests recorded sacred rituals, and scholars preserved knowledge for future generations. Clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, and bamboo slips carried the ideas that shaped entire civilizations. But access to writing was extremely limited. In most ancient societies, literacy belonged almost entirely to men. Scribes were trained in specialized schools, priests controlled religious texts, and historians were usually attached to royal courts or government institutions. Education itself was often restricted to boys from elite families. Women were expected to focus on household management, family duties, and maintaining social order. Yet despite these restrictions, some women found ways to write. Across the ancient world, a handful of female voices emerged from the silence imposed by tradition. Their words survived in poetry, hymns, philosophical essays, historical chronicles, and letters. Sometimes these women belonged to powerful families that allowed them access to education. In other cases, they held religious positions that required literacy. A few may even have written privately, their works preserved only by chance. What makes these voices remarkable is not only what they wrote, but the fact that they wrote at all. One of the earliest known authors in human history was a woman named Enheduanna, who lived in Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago. She served as a high priestess in the city of and composed powerful hymns dedicated to the goddess Inanna. Her works were copied by scribes for centuries, making her one of the first writers whose name we actually know. Centuries later, another voice would rise from the islands of ancient Greece. The poet Sappho of Lesbos wrote lyrical poems about love, beauty, and human emotion. Her writing was so admired that later Greek scholars called her the 10th Muse. Although much of her work has been lost, fragments of her poetry still survive, revealing a voice that feels deeply personal, even thousands of years later. In China, the historian and scholar Ban Zhao wrote essays and historical works during the Han Dynasty, contributing to one of the most important chronicles of early Chinese history. These women lived in very different cultures, separated by vast distances and centuries of time. Yet they shared something powerful. They refused to remain silent in a world that rarely expected women to speak through writing. More than 4,000 years ago, in the ancient land of Mesopotamia, a woman wrote words that would echo through history. Her name was Enheduanna, and she is widely considered the earliest known author in the world whose name we can identify. Enheduanna lived during the 23rd century before Christ, in the powerful Akkadian Empire founded by her father, Sargon of Akkad. Sargon was one of the first rulers in history to unite multiple cities under a single empire, stretching across much of Mesopotamia. In order to strengthen his rule, he placed trusted family members in important religious and political positions. Enheduanna became the high priestess of the moon god, Nanna, in the sacred city of This position was not only religious, but also political. Temples in Mesopotamia were centers of economic power, controlling land, wealth, and influence. As high priestess, Enheduanna stood at the intersection of religion, politics, and culture. But she did something even more remarkable. She wrote, on clay tablets using the cuneiform writing system, Enheduanna composed a series of hymns dedicated to the goddess Inanna, one of the most powerful deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon. These hymns were not simple prayers. They were carefully structured literary works, filled with imagery, emotion, and theological ideas. In one of her most famous compositions, known today as the Exaltation of Inanna, Enheduanna describes the goddess as a force of cosmic power capable of both destruction and protection. The text also contains something rare for ancient literature. Enheduanna speaks in the first person. She describes her own struggles, including a period when she was expelled from her priestly position during a political rebellion. In the poem, she appeals directly to the goddess for help, blending personal experience with religious devotion. This makes her work incredibly significant. For the first time in recorded history, we see an author presenting their own voice and identity within a written text. Her writings became so respected that scribes copied them for centuries in Mesopotamian schools. Students learning to write cuneiform practiced by copying Enheduanna's hymns, ensuring that her words survived long after her lifetime. Thousands of years later, archaeologists would uncover those clay tablets buried beneath the sands of Iraq. And with them came the rediscovery of one of the earliest literary voices in human history. More than 1,000 years after Enheduanna wrote her hymns in Mesopotamia, another powerful female voice emerged in the ancient Greek world. Her name was Sappho, and she would become one of the most celebrated poets of antiquity. Sappho lived around the 7th century before Christ on the island of Lesbos in the Aegean Sea. At the time, Greek culture was entering a period of artistic and intellectual growth. Poetry was one of the most important forms of expression, performed aloud during festivals, religious ceremonies, and gatherings among the elite. Most poets of the era were men who wrote about war, heroism, and the deeds of legendary figures. Sappho's poetry was very different. Rather than focusing on battle or epic adventure, her verses explored personal emotion. She wrote about love, longing, beauty, friendship, and the intense feelings that connect human beings to one another. Her poetry often addressed individuals directly, making it feel intimate and immediate, even across thousands of years. Unlike epic poets such as Homer, whose works told long, heroic stories, Sappho specialized in lyric poetry. These poems were meant to be sung or recited with musical accompaniment, usually the lyre. This is where the term lyric poetry itself originates. Ancient Greek writers admired her deeply. The philosopher Plato reportedly called Sappho the 10th muse, placing her alongside the 9 divine muses believed to inspire artistic creation. Other Greek scholars ranked her among the greatest poets of their age. Sappho may have led a circle of young women devoted to music, poetry, and education. In this setting, she likely composed many of her poems for performances during religious festivals or social gatherings. Unfortunately, much of her work has been lost. In antiquity, her poems were collected into several volumes, but over the centuries, most of these manuscripts disappeared. Today, only fragments of her poetry survive, preserved through quotations in later writings or discovered on damaged pieces of papyrus. Yet even these fragments are enough to reveal her extraordinary talent. One surviving poem describes the physical sensations of love so vividly that readers can almost feel the speaker's racing heart and trembling voice. The emotional intensity of her writing feels strikingly modern. Through these surviving lines, Sappho's voice continues to echo across time, and she remains one of the clearest reminders that even in the ancient world, women found ways to shape literature and express their own experiences through writing. While poets like Sappho were writing in the Mediterranean world, another remarkable female voice would later emerge far to the east in ancient China. Her name was Ban Zhao, and she lived during the Han Dynasty, one of the most influential periods in Chinese history. Ban Zhao was born around the 1st century after Christ into an educated and highly respected family of scholars. The Ban family was deeply involved in the intellectual life of the Han court. Her father, Ban Biao, was a historian, and her brothers continued his work compiling an important historical record known as the Book of Han. Unlike most women of her time, Ban Zhao received a strong education from an early age. Within elite Chinese families, learning was highly valued, and the Ban household was filled with books, scholarship, and discussion. This environment allowed her to develop the skills that would later make her one of the most famous female scholars in Chinese history. After the deaths of her father and brother, the task of completing the Book of Han remained unfinished. Ban Zhao stepped in to help complete the massive historical project. This work documented the history of the Western Han dynasty, including political events, government institutions, and biographies of important figures. Her role in finishing such a major historical record was extraordinary. Historiography in ancient China was usually dominated by male scholars serving the imperial court. Yet Ban Zhao's knowledge and reputation were so respected that she was invited to the palace to assist in the project and even to teach members of the imperial family. She eventually became a tutor to women in the royal court, instructing them in literature, history, and moral philosophy. Ban Zhao is also famous for writing a work called Lessons for Women. This text offered guidance on proper conduct, education, and responsibilities within society. While it encouraged traditional values of humility and obedience, it also argued that women should receive education so they could fulfill their roles wisely and responsibly. This idea was important. In a society where female education was often neglected, Ban Zhao believed that women could not be expected to behave virtuously if they were never taught how to understand moral principles. Her writings show a careful balance between respecting social traditions and advocating for women's intellectual development. Through her scholarship, Ban Zhao became one of the most influential female thinkers in ancient China, and her voice reminds us that even within rigid social systems, some women managed to shape history through knowledge and writing. While Sappho remains the most famous female poet of ancient Greece, she was not the only woman whose voice echoed through the literary world of antiquity. Another intriguing figure was Corinna, a poet from the Greek region of Boeotia who lived sometime between the 6th and 5th centuries before Christ. Unlike Sappho's deeply personal lyric poetry, Corinna's work focused on mythological storytelling. Her poems retold ancient Greek myths, legends, and heroic tales, but often with unique variations that differed from the more familiar versions told by male poets. Ancient sources suggest that Corinna was highly respected during her lifetime. Some traditions even claim that she competed in poetic contests against the famous poet Pindar, who is widely considered one of the greatest lyric poets of ancient Greece. According to later writers, Corinna reportedly defeated him several times in these competitions. Whether these stories are fully accurate or not, they reveal something important about her reputation. Corinna was remembered as a poet, capable of rivaling the greatest male writers of her era. Her poems were composed in the Boeotian dialect, the regional form of Greek spoken in her homeland. This made her work feel more connected to local traditions and audiences. Rather than imitating the style of poets from Athens or other cultural centres, Corinna embraced the identity of her own region. Many of her surviving fragments focus on myths connected specifically to Boeotia. By retelling these stories in poetic form, she preserved regional legends that might otherwise have been forgotten. Unfortunately, as with many ancient writers, most of her work has not survived. Only fragments remain, discovered on damaged papyrus manuscripts or quoted by later authors. These pieces suggest that her poetry combined narrative storytelling with vivid imagery drawn from Greek mythology. Ancient commentators also described her as a teacher of poetry. Some traditions claim she advised younger poets, helping them refine their style and technique. If this is true, it would mean Corinna's influence extended beyond her own writing. She may have helped shape the literary culture around her, contributing to the development of Greek poetry during an important period of artistic growth. Although much of her work has disappeared over the centuries, the memory of Corinna survives as another example of a woman who found a voice in a literary world often dominated by men. Her fragments are small, but they remind us that ancient literature was shaped by more than just the famous male poets, whose names fill history books. Not all women writers in the ancient world expressed themselves through poetry or religious hymns. Some contributed to philosophy, mathematics, and scientific thought. One of the most remarkable examples was Hypatia of Alexandria, a scholar whose life blended intellectual brilliance with dramatic historical conflict. Hypatia lived during the late 4th and early 5th centuries after Christ in the city of Alexandria, one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. Alexandria was famous for its libraries, schools of philosophy, and communities of scholars who studied mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Hypatia grew up in an environment devoted to knowledge. Her father, Theon of Alexandria, was a mathematician and teacher who worked with scientific texts and astronomical calculations. He ensured that his daughter received the same intellectual education that male scholars enjoyed. This education made Hypatia extraordinary for her time. She became a philosopher associated with the Neoplatonic school, a tradition inspired by the ideas of the Greek philosopher Plato. Neoplatonic philosophy explored questions about the nature of reality, the soul, and the relationship between the physical world and divine truth. Hypatia taught students who came to Alexandria from across the Mediterranean. She gave lectures on philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy, often explaining complex ideas through clear and thoughtful discussion. Although many of her original writings have not survived, historical sources describe several works she produced. These included commentaries on mathematical texts and scientific treatises that helped explain earlier discoveries. Commentaries were extremely important in the ancient world because they helped preserve and interpret older knowledge. Hypatia's reputation for wisdom and clarity made her one of the most respected intellectual figures in Alexandria. However, the city itself was undergoing intense political and religious tensions. Christianity was becoming the dominant force within the Roman Empire, while older pagan philosophical traditions were declining. Alexandria became a place where religious and political factions often clashed. Hypatia, as a prominent philosopher associated with traditional learning, found herself caught in these conflicts. In 415 after Christ, a violent mob attacked her in the streets of Alexandria and killed her. Her death shocked the intellectual world of the time and became a symbol of the tragic conflict between scholarship and fanaticism. Despite this brutal end, Hypatia's legacy endured. She remains one of the most famous female scholars of antiquity, remembered not only for her intellect, but also for the courage with which she pursued knowledge in a turbulent world. Compared to Greece or China, the literary record of women in ancient Rome is surprisingly thin. Roman society valued education among elite families, and some women were highly literate, yet very few female-authored texts have survived. This does not mean Roman women were silent. It simply means their voices were rarely preserved. Most Roman literature that survives today was written by male senators, historians and poets, such as Virgil, Horace, and Ovid. The writings of women were often considered private, informal, or unimportant to preserve in official collections. As a result, much of what Roman women wrote has likely been lost. Yet fragments remain. One of the most fascinating glimpses into female writing comes from letters and inscriptions. Roman women often communicated through personal letters, and some of these have survived through remarkable archaeological discoveries. The Vindolanda tablets, for example, found near Hadrian's Wall in Britain, include correspondence between Roman women living in a frontier military community. One letter, written by a woman named Claudia Severa, invites a friend to her birthday celebration. It may seem simple, but it represents one of the earliest known examples of writing by a woman in the Latin language. The letter shows something deeply human. Instead of discussing politics or war, Claudia writes about friendship, celebration, and social connection. Her words feel personal and familiar, reminding us that ancient women shared many of the same emotions and relationships we experience today. Roman women also composed poetry, though much of it survives only through references by male writers. Some aristocratic women participated in literary circles where poetry and philosophy were discussed among educated elites. One example is Sulpicia, a poet from the 1st century before Christ. Her poems, preserved within a larger collection of Roman love poetry, reveal a direct and confident voice. In her verses, she openly writes about love and desire, something that was rarely expressed so personally by female authors in Roman literature. Through figures like Claudia Severa and Sulpicia, we catch rare glimpses of Roman women using writing to express their thoughts and emotions. Their voices appear only briefly in the historical record, like small lights in a vast landscape of lost literature. But those lights remind us that women in ancient Rome were not simply passive observers of history. They were participants, thinkers, and writers, even if time preserved only fragments of their words. For many women in the ancient world, the safest path to literacy and writing often passed through religion. Temples, priesthoods, and spiritual communities sometimes allowed women access to education and intellectual life that ordinary society denied them. Religion created spaces where women could write. In ancient Mesopotamia, priestesses like Enheduanna held positions that required literacy. Temples controlled land, wealth, and ritual traditions, and the women who served within them often composed hymns, prayers, and ceremonial texts. Their writings were not simply expressions of devotion. They were part of the religious structure that connected people with the divine. A similar pattern appeared in other civilizations. In ancient Egypt, priestesses and elite women sometimes participated in temple life, where sacred texts and rituals were carefully recorded. While most surviving Egyptian texts were written by male scribes, evidence suggests that some women participated in religious education and may have contributed to the production or preservation of sacred literature. In Greece as well, religious life opened certain intellectual doors. Some female poets were closely connected to religious festivals and ceremonial performances. Poetry was often performed during sacred celebrations honouring gods such as Apollo or Aphrodite. Women who composed songs or hymns for these events could gain recognition as respected poets within their communities. Even philosophical traditions sometimes intersected with religious devotion. In late antiquity, many scholars who studied philosophy also explored spiritual questions about the soul, the nature of the universe, and humanity's connection to divine reality. Women who participated in these intellectual traditions, such as Hypatia, often combined philosophical inquiry with spiritual themes. Religion therefore became a bridge between private life and public expression. Within temples or sacred communities, women could learn to read, compose texts, and participate in rituals that required written knowledge. Their words were sometimes preserved because religious texts were copied carefully over generations. Without these institutions, many female voices might have disappeared entirely. Yet even within these religious environments, women still faced limitations. Their writings were often framed within the expectations of devotion, humility, and obedience. Public recognition remained rare, and many texts written by women may have circulated anonymously. Still, the existence of these works reveals something powerful. Across many ancient cultures, women used the spaces available to them, temples, courts, schools, and private circles, to shape literature, philosophy, and spiritual thought. And through these writings, their voices quietly endured. Although only fragments of their works survive, the writings of ancient women continue to echo across thousands of years. Their voices emerged from civilizations separated by vast distances and cultures, yet they share a common story. Each of these women wrote in a world where writing itself was largely controlled by men, and yet they wrote anyway. Some, like Enheduanna, held powerful religious positions that allowed them access to education and influence. Through her hymns, she shaped the spiritual language of Mesopotamia and became the earliest known author whose name we can identify. Her voice survives on clay tablets that were copied for centuries by students learning to write. Others, like Sappho, transformed poetry itself. Her verses about love, longing, and human emotion revealed a deeply personal voice, rarely preserved in ancient literature. Even though most of her poems have been lost, the fragments that remain are still studied, translated, and admired today. In China, Banzhao proved that scholarship and historical writing were not limited to men. By helping complete the Book of Han and writing essays on education and moral philosophy, she became one of the most respected intellectual figures of the Han dynasty. And in Alexandria, Hypatia demonstrated that women could stand at the center of philosophical and scientific thought. Her teaching and scholarship attracted students from across the Mediterranean, and her tragic death became a symbol of the struggle between knowledge and intolerance. Beyond these well-known figures were countless others whose names we may never know. Women wrote letters, poems, prayers, and stories that circulated within families, religious communities, and local literary circles. Many of these works disappeared as manuscripts decayed or libraries were destroyed. History preserved only a small portion of what once existed. Yet the survival of even a few voices tells us something important. Women were never completely absent from the intellectual life of the ancient world. They found ways to learn, to think, and to write, despite the restrictions placed upon them. Their writings remind us that literature has always been shaped by many different voices, even when history preserved only a few. Today, scholars continue to search for new fragments, inscriptions, and manuscripts that might reveal more about these forgotten writers, and each discovery adds another echo to a chorus that began thousands of years ago, the voices of women who refused to remain silent.